in that. Well, we're so glad that you're here today. We're going to go ahead and try to start on time, or almost on time anyway. And I just want to, again, welcome you to the OilPatch lecture series. And we're not going to refer to it too much as the OilPatch lecture anymore, because you mentioned the word lectures and people, their eyes start rolling back, and they say, I don't want to go hear one more lecture. So this is a series, OilPatch series. And my good friend, Reverend Dr. Tom Fuller, and wife Connie is here tonight. We're so happy that they came down all the way from the big town of Lubbock. But I think they brought the panhandle wind with them, I think. And we're glad to have y'all here. Just a little background on Tom, and I wish I knew what I had planned on doing was doing a little study where I have an eloquent introduction for Tom, but that went by the wayside about noon on Wednesday when Peggy tripped and fell and broke her hip. But I've known Tom a long time, because Tom started out up in the... did you start out in the Texas Panhandle?
Yes,
I think in Stinnett. Stinnet's just south of Groover, about 35, 36 miles. Danny Poole knows where Stinnett is very well. You grew up in Morse, didn't you? Or was it Stinnett? Okay. So you've got at least 2 Panhandle boys in here, and 3 from the pastor that was there. And I accused him a little while ago of bringing the West Texas Panhandle weather, the wind down here, because this is normal for Groover. I forget how the wind blows up there. I go up there and I think, my gosh, the wind blows. But anyway, we're so happy that you're here. So Tom was the pastor in Groover in 1978 through 82 when our church burned to the ground. A horrible blizzard blew in one night. The wind was so bad it caused the electrical wiring in the back of the church, I believe, to arc and set it on fire, something along those lines. Okay. Anyway, it burnt to the ground, and my daddy and a lot of other people worked with Tom to get that mess cleaned up and picked up in the middle of that blizzard. And then Tom was part of that, raising money, I suppose, for the building project there. Did they get the new church built while you were there? Okay. So Tom, and so my sisters know Connie. My sisters are twins. Connie's a twin, if I'm not mistaken. And so my family and Tom's family just go back a lot. And it means a lot to me for us to be able to bring him here, because not only is he a friend, which we don't ever see one another hardly, except at maybe annual conference every 4 or 5 years, but Tom is a scholar, like I've told you, on John Wesley and Charles Wesley. And us just having disaffiliated from the United Methodist Church and becoming Global Methodist Church, I think it's just really important that we focus in on Wesleyanism, and our roots. And Tom's going to let you know right up front, this isn't anything new. Change has been going on for a long time within the church in different ways and different factions. And it's I think you're really going to get so much out of this. I know you're going to get a lot out of this series. Well, anyway, enough about all of that. Tom was in Oakwood and Lubbock for about 8 years or so, and then he was a general evangelist in the United Methodist Church from 2006 to 2013 until the disaffiliation happened, and Tom became a global Methodist preacher back about that time, and now he is volunteer pastor at Oakwood in Lubbock, Texas. And I think that's probably about all I need to say right now. I don't want to take any more away from Tom, but just again, Tom and Connie, we just give you a warm welcome from First Methodist Church here in Odessa, Texas. We're thrilled that you're here, and we're just going to turn it over. Tom's going to also have some books and stuff out at some point. He's written several books on Tom Wesley. Again, he's a scholar. You want to try to get some if you can.
Scholar is just
someone who knows a little bit more than you do in one narrow area. So thank you, Jody, my good friend, my forever friend, for that exaggerated introduction. I love being with people introducing me who haven't seen me in 30 years. Anyway, we had so much fun back then. Can you see me? Okay, I'm sometimes kind of hard to see, but I don't like pulpits. Some of them are larger than I am. And we got a bit of a problem because what's projecting up here is not projecting back there. So I can't see what you see. Can you? Can he do that, Casey? Casey's saying you can't do that. Okay. Well, let him try. Make him feel like he's, accomplishing something. Can you? Well, there's something.
No, it's going through the other computer, so it doesn't work, Tom. I'm sorry.
Let's space him better.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to angle myself a little bit here so that I can make sure that what I'm talking about is what you're seeing. And I so thank you for inviting me, brother. I suggested we not use the word lectures. Lectures is fine, but when I was in school and they had the Wilson lectures, I'm sure Mr. Wilson was a wonderful man, but they were always so boring at least to a freshman, and who was interested in other things. The problem was with me, not with the lecturer, I'm sure. But I did learn to try to make things interesting. Okay, you know how textbooks are. You feel sometimes that the author took lessons on how to be boring, or is that just me? I don't know. I didn't really love studying academics and all until I started studying about John Wesley, and I studied church growth. I went to Perkins School of Theology as seminary for my master's, and then I went to Fuller Seminary, which is an independent school, and began studying church growth. And I learned out there of what makes churches grow. I love that. That subject just fascinated me. And I realized that much of what I was hearing, how these independent churches were growing and they were sharing their secrets, I had heard somewhere before. And it was in John Wesley. They were stealing our stuff, our ideas. And yet we had abandoned those very same ideas. And so I thought, we in the Methodist Church need to do something. We need to return to our roots, because I'm going to show you tomorrow, I think, some slides on some statistics. And you know the problems with the United Methodist Church. I love the United Methodist Church. I committed my career to it. I've always been a Methodist and then United Methodist. I intended to do that just like with marriage. I made vows to uphold it until I couldn't do it anymore. The problem is the United Methodist Church left me a long time ago. And you and I and we have sadly disaffiliated most. Some of you may not have, but I'm going to share with you today John Wesley's life, at least what I find fascinating about it, up until his conversion. In the morning, Sunday morning, I want to share with you why I believe disaffiliation was mandatory. Why? If you have any doubts, I bet you some of you still have a lot of grief over that. I do. It grieved me terribly. Still does. But if you have any doubts, if it was necessary, I'm going to share with you some things, some facts and realities about that in the morning, and why, if you have any questions, hope to answer those things. But it will be toward a wonderful end, because these things happen cyclically down through history, and God's church is still here, and so we have a wonderful opportunity now to start over again. If the name on the sign is the only thing we change, we will have missed an opportunity of a lifetime, and that is to start a truly scriptural church. Wouldn't that be amazing if we did that? I just hope we don't think we're too old or too tired or too fill in the blank to do that, because we're not. John Wesley, when he organized a 100-city preaching tour all across the four kingdoms when he was 87 years old. Now, how many of you have said, oh, let the young people do that? Okay. Well, that's not Wesleyan, okay? So I'm going to tell you some amazing things. And and then I'm going to tell you tomorrow, is it afternoon, about John Wesley after Aldersgate. And that's when it really gears up and gets exciting. And then the next Monday morning, I'm going to talk about something about Wesley's beliefs, his balanced biblical beliefs, and a little bit maybe, if we have time, on how we at Oakwood applied that. When I was studying church growth, applying Wesley's principles, and the church grew. And I'm going to tell you exactly what we did. And then I'm going to close on Monday night with a great experiment. And I don't expect a lot, okay? Because I have many things that have grieved me about the church, and one that grieves me about the contemporary church is our loss of a love for our hymnody. We are losing our hymns, and I don't think we realize what a treasure they are. It is said, someone said, if all the Bibles in the world were lost, you could reconstruct them almost by 95% from Charles Wesley's hymns. And I want the church to fall in love with our hymns again. And so I've written a drama about Charles Wesley, and we're going to sing a bunch of his hymns together, and I'm going to tell you the stories behind those. All right? So please come back. It will be a dress rehearsal. Won't charge anything, okay? So don't get your hopes up. I'll have my script because I still haven't committed it to memory. But anyway, I became fascinated. This little book, if you could still get it on Amazon, Strangely Warmed, The Amazing Life of John Wesley, by an Anglican clergyman named Garth Lean from England. John Wesley was an Anglican. The Anglican Church was the church that King Henry VIII founded, auspicious beginnings, because the Pope wouldn't grant him a divorce. So he decided he was the king, and so he would get his own divorce. And so he founded the Anglican Church. John Wesley was an Anglican. He never separated from the Anglican Church. He loved it. He loved its high church liturgy and the dignity and everything that went with that. And he even at his death, he knew that the Methodists would, but he said, it's not going to be on my watch. So Garth Lean, this was just the best little biography that I read. You can read it in a couple of evenings. And just every word was important. And that's what got me started on loving John Wesley. Now, if you worry about today, and if you watch Fox News or CNN, you should worry about today, okay? Is there anyone who's, with all your lights burning, who doesn't worry about where in the world is our country headed and where in the world is the church headed? The good news is God's church cannot be even scratched, okay? Denominations will rise and fall, but God's church is not confined to buildings, and it is something entirely above all of our little schemes and things. But still, at times, if you're worried, well, there have been other times where Christians who could think clearly were also worried. And if you had been a Christian, or anyone really, living in England in the few years before John Wesley was born, you would have looked around and said, this can't last. Things are just too far gone. Our culture is just too thoroughly compromised, immoral, and broken. Alcoholism was common among just about everybody. Government officials, the clergy. There were child alcoholics everywhere, all over England. And part of that was the water was contaminated, and people drank wine more than they drank water, just for safety reasons, among others. But still, it was just, you can imagine what a malaise and of the problems that inflicted upon culture. This was a famous pair of political cartoons that a man named William Hogarth published and printed in newspapers and things. And this is, what is this called? It's called the corner of Gin Lane and Beer Street and Gin Lane. And this sort of illustrated the problem back then. But not as you would expect. There was a great government move called, I think, the Gin Act to make drinking cheap, strong gin harder and harder by raising taxes and costs and other things, because it was wrecking society. And instead go to beer, because that's what finer people did. And so the cartoon on the left shows the advantages of drinking beer, and on the right the disadvantages of drinking gin. And I can't even go into all the details of that, but there, as you see in the lower right-hand corner, there's a man who's dying of starvation, and then there's a drunk mother who's dropping her child in the middle. Up in the upper right-hand corner of the right picture, there's a man hanging from a noose, and on and on. And that's just sort of a snapshot of the culture, at least through the eye of William Hogarth. During Wesley's entire lifetime, government punished women for adultery by the pillory, putting their hands and the stocks, putting the hands and neck in public disgrace, public flogging, burning at the stake, depending on how much money and influence their husbands had. Males, however, were different. Unfaithfulness among males was considered sport, and when a man was caught with another woman, society blamed the man's wife. And that was standard thinking back then. In Wesley's day, executions were a weekly and sometimes a daily thing. They had a common place called Tyburn, this triangular-shaped gallows, which would hold, a couple of dozen miscreants of the condemned at once. Executioners, after the deed was done, they would sever their heads and impale them on spikes and display them on London Bridge as a warning for thieves and others who might even consider doing things like that. Wesley often would walk by London Bridge and see such sights. Prisons were full of people of all genders, all ages, all classes. People were thrown into these disease-infested dungeons for debt. In fact, Samuel Wesley was in debt several times, and he got thrown into one of these prisons. You think your preacher's done embarrassing things. Worse than that, the bishop had to bail him out. Don't you hate it when that happens? And he was always poor, and whether, if you owed someone money, there were pawnbrokers, but they charged outlandish percentages and fees for their services. And if you couldn't pay a debt back, the one you owed money to could go like this or this, could either forgive you or give you terms, or he could have you thrown into prison, and you couldn't get out of prison until you paid the debt. But you couldn't pay the debt as long as you were in prison. Children were hanged for stealing food. John and Charles's diaries are full of references where they will go down to Newgate Prison, the great big prison in central London, and they will ride in the death cart to Tyburn, about 10 blocks away, with the children who are to be executed. And they refer quite a bit to describe the things that they would say to these children when they were being carried to the gallows. And they would talk about how you have nothing to worry about. You're going to close your eyes, and you're going to open your eyes in the arms of your Father, your Heavenly Father. I mean, can anyone think of a pastoral duty that's worse, more odious than something like that? And yes, this was a regular thing. So this is life in England back when John Wesley was born, right before he was born and most of his life. Slavery was legal all during John Wesley's life. He was a militant opponent of slavery, and he was a friend of William Wilberforce and others who finally got slavery outlawed. Now, John's two parents were very different. Susanna and Samuel. the UMW and the United Methodist Church has done a good job of talking about Susanna and describing her. They came from, they were both from nonconformist backgrounds. Now the Anglican Church was very formal. It's a legal arm of the government even to this day, and they were rebels. In a little earlier, but before John Wesley's life, about 30 years earlier, had been enacted the Act of Uniformity. The law, the Parliament enacted this law that said you had to worship with the Anglican Book of Common Prayer on Sunday morning. Everybody had to do it the same. Well, the Puritans were people who didn't like that. They said, no, that's too Roman Catholic, and Roman Catholic Church has all kinds of corruption about it. And so they were called nonconformists or dissenters. The government didn't like it at all, and they persecuted them, but they had after a while, certain allowances for nonconformists. Both of Samuel and Susanna, their parents and grandparents were rebellious dissenters, okay? And her father, Samuel Annesley, was called the Prince of Nonconformity. He was a well-known fellow. And so they both grew up rebels, but at a certain point, when they were in young adulthood, they both made the conscious choice. No, they didn't want to go that way. So they wanted to remain with the Anglican Church and use the Anglican prayer book. However, they still both had rebellious bones, okay? And that came through a lot. And John Wesley got some of that. Samuel, they had this little church called Epworth, a little town, and he was the rector at Epworth. Now, in England, they got it all laid out. They have parishes, which they call shires, and he was in Lincolnshire in central eastern England, a little tiny rural place, and he was the rector. And he was legally the pastor over everybody in that shire or in that county. And all worked out. But an author, Basil Miller, in his book John Wesley, said this about Sam. They didn't like him, okay? He was always making his parishioners mad. You've never had a preacher like that. He said this about Samuel. His usual opponents were his parishioners. He irritated them so much, they stabbed his cattle, maimed his dog, probably set fire to his crops and house, threatened to, quote, squeeze his guts out, unquote, and, quote, turn his children out of doors a-begging. These were Samuel's words. In 1701, Samuel's barn mysteriously collapsed. In 1702, the rectory, the one on the top, partially burned mysteriously. In 1703, his flax crop burned. In 1709, his entire rectory was destroyed by fire, and John Wesley was nearly killed in that one. Samuel wrote to a friend, We now have very little more than what Adam and Eve had when they first set up housekeeping. Most of my friends advise me to leave Epworth. I confess I am not of that mind, because I may do good there yet, and 'tis like a coward to desert my post simply because the enemy's fire is thick upon me. You ever had a preacher like that? No names, okay, but he was there 38 years. All right, that's where the bishop leaves a preacher that he really doesn't like. It tends to be. Susanna was not as fiery in that way, but she was in other ways. Susanna was a very liberated, independent woman, not as they say today, but she was just very intelligent, highly educated, and had her own way of doing things. John was born on June 17th, 1703. He was the 15th of 19 children. Okay? He was the second surviving son. I believe 9 or 10 of their children did not survive past babyhood. His birthday was June 17th, but when he turned about 50, his birthday became June 28th, because around then, Britain changed over from the old Julian calendar, which was the one Julius Caesar set up, to the Gregorian calendar, which is the one that Pope Gregory set up. And that gave us leap year, is basically what it did. So he considered his birthday June 28th, the latter one. I told you that Samuel was frequently in debt, and he was also frequently gone to London on meetings. So Susanna had a lot of time on her hands alone. She homeschooled her children, and Susanna's policy on educating children. I read some of these, and people, especially women, gasp. What do you think about these? So after John left home and went to Oxford, he wrote her and he said, "What were your principles on bringing us up?" She said, "When they turned a year old, they were taught to fear the rod and to cry softly." That most odious noise of crying of children was rarely heard in the house. Our children were taught as soon as they could speak the Lord's Prayer. As they grew bigger, were added a short prayer for their parents and some collects, a short catechism, and some portion of Scripture, as much as their memories could bear. There was no such thing as loud talking or playing aloud. Everyone kept close to business for the 6 hours of school. It is almost incredible what a child may be taught in a quarter of a year by vigorous application. Rising out of their places or going out of a room was not permitted, except for a good cause. Running into the yard, garden, or street without leave was always considered a capital offense. Whoever was charged with a fault, if they sincerely confessed and promised to make amends, they should not be beaten. No sinful action should ever go unpunished. No child should ever be chided or beaten twice for the same fault. There you go. Double jeopardy. Every act of obedience should always be commended and frequently rewarded. I insist on conquering the will of children because this is the only strong and rational foundation of a religious education. What do you think about that? Okay. Well, be thinking, ponder that in your heart, right, Mary? All right, but anyway, with 19 children and no husband most of the time, I imagine things had to be pretty rigid back then, don't you think? Before John was born, Samuel and Susanna were saying a prayer, Samuel was, in the evening, as he always did. And when he prayed, ended it with "God save the King, Amen," he noticed about the fourth time that Susanna, Suki he called her, was not saying Amen, as she should. And he asked her why, and she said, because the king is not the king. His cousin's the king. King James had been dethroned a few years earlier, and his cousin had been put on the throne. And this was one of their great disagreements. And so Samuel said, "Well, Suki, if we have 2 kings, then we must have 2 beds." And so he next morning packed up and went to London for a couple of months. Back then, if a preacher was gone, it really didn't matter, okay? Because hardly anyone came to worship anyway. If they came for the sacraments. Sermons were usually political treatises, and it was just not like it is today. And also, there was no collection, and still to this day, there's no collection taken up because churches were government funded. So, the church would go proudly marching on. Anybody was supporting it or not. So Samuel would often go to London on these conferences and things, which Susanna thought a waste of money. And anyway, when he heard this, and he made a decision that he was going to divorce Susanna. And she had 6 little children at the time in the parsonage. She wrote in her journal, she kept a journal, and she said, "I have 6 little children and only a few pennies to my name. I have no idea what I'm going to do." So after a while, during one of his London excursions, in the absence of a priest, Susanna started a Bible study, which was unheard of, in the kitchen. And in just a few weeks, she had over 200 attending her Bible study, which is far more than Samuel ever saw in the sanctuary on the Sabbath day. And Samuel got wind of this, and he didn't like it at all, how things are. And so he wrote her a letter telling her, he's showing her his high disapproval. And she had spunk, and she wrote back. She said, back when you lived here, he said, we were having only a handful in worship. We're having 200 now, and I see the fruits of my teachings borne out in many areas. She said, I am not of a mind to do what you say, but if you insist, I need not remind you of the consequences. You have no idea what that meant. But anyway, whatever it was, he said, all right, but you may continue, but at my disapproval. And so she continued, saw this. She was an amazing Bible teacher, and Samuel didn't like it at all. But anyway, he came home from London, and he was determined that he was going to leave her, and he was going to join the Navy, become a chaplain. But in the night when he was back, he was in bed, and someone in the city was very perturbed at him, and it was some of his parishioners. He never found out whom, but the parsonage got set on fire inconveniently. Samuel got up, woke up to the smell of smoke, and he rushed his family out, and they got the fire out. But it was so traumatic that it affected a reconciliation between Samuel and Susanna. 9 months, how do I say this? 9 months later, what do you think happened? John Wesley happened, that's right. 9 months later, John Wesley was born. And Susanna considered this providential from God. Not only had her marriage been spared, her life had been spared, but she got a baby out of the deal. And so Susanna, from his very first breaths, considered John Wesley a special child, given by God for some great purpose. And she let him know that every chance that he had. She paid special attention to him, especially taught him the scriptures and other things. Now, when John was 5 years old, evidently his parishioners who did not succeed with that first fire, we had a fire, didn't we? It brought us together. I was amazed I'm reminding myself of our fire. The church burned down shortly after I got there. I promise I didn't do it, but I thought, offerings were terrible. Were really hard, and I thought we can't really build back. They did, and your dad, Oliver, who had one prosthetic leg because of injuries from World War II, worked harder at cleaning out that old church than just about anybody else. I had no idea how a man who was supposed to be, handicapped, did such work, and I grew so in love with your family back then, and especially respect for and he's all.
Okay, we've got. Hold on. Can you come up here?
Yeah, much as I just like.
Okay. I'll go see if I can get this one.
Okay, you're fine. You're fine. It happens every time. Listen. Church sound equipment is demon possessed. All right.
Charles Crutchfield used to say that. The
There you
devil
go.
lives in the sound system.
The devil lives in the sound system. And it works fine until Sunday morning, or in this case, Saturday afternoon. All right, so I'll have to crane my neck, but just you'll understand. Where was I? Okay, so the second time when John was 5, the parishioners decided they would do a thorough job of getting rid of their preacher one way or the other. If the bishop wasn't going to do it by a move, they were going to do it by fire. So they set the parsonage at several different places, and Samuel woke up to the sound of neighbors shouting in the street that the rectory was on fire. He got up, he woke the servants, and they scurried and got the little children out onto the street. Susanna woke up. She made 2 or 3 trips in. Susanna, for the rest of her life, had scars on her feet, John Wesley mentioned, from running over hot coals. When they finally got the children out and they were counting heads, they realized that John was not among them. And he had slept through it, is what happened. And one of the neighbors, John, said that when he finally woke up, when they were all out, he saw flames licking across the ceiling of his bedroom. He got up, he tried to get out the door. He was on the 2nd floor, but the whole stairway was consumed with fire. He got up on a trunk and he looked out the window and saw the family down there. And Samuel had given him up for lost, because the staircase had already collapsed. And he thought he was dead. But a neighbor saw him up there. They looked for a ladder, didn't have one, and the neighbors formed a human totem pole, and the 2nd or 3rd neighbor on the top grabbed John Wesley by his arms, pulled him out of the window just a split second before the roof collapsed behind him. And Susanna was horrified. Samuel was praying on the front lawn to get him to commend him to God. But Susanna, this just reinforced her idea, this sense that she had that John was intended for something great. And so from that point on, she called him the brand plucked from the burning. And in the first hymn that Charles wrote, "Where shall my wandering soul begin?" there is a line. It says, "How shall I all to heaven aspire? A slave redeemed from death and sin, a brand plucked from eternal fire." This was a theme that recurred in the Wesleys all of their life. So again, she began doubling down, tripling down on John's self-awareness as someone who is going to be greatly used by God. They sent him to, there's the fire. All right. I'm behind. See, there's Samuel praying, "God, Lord, receive John," while the neighbors are rescuing John. And there he is. Okay. Does it work? Did you work a healing on this? Did you lay your hands on it? Care if I'm down here or down there or up here? Does it matter? All right. Okay. I'll just stay here. Let's do both, just like a supplemental insurance policy. John went as soon as he was school-worthy, or of the age, he went to Charterhouse School on a charity scholarship, and he was there for a number of years. He was smaller than all the other kids, and in the dining hall, bullies would bully him and steal his food, but he learned in every adversity is advantage. And so he learned that he said, for a number of years, I had little except bread and water to live on, and not much of that. However, he said, but you know what? I learned that I didn't need much more than bread and water to survive. He wrote Samuel back home, and he said, well, exercise and run around and stay as healthy as you can. And John at Charterhouse began learning about the stewardship of the body, and he began being a serious student of healthful foods and other things that he needed to do. In a few years, he would write one of the first home remedy books called The Primitive Physic. And in it are just a number of home remedies for coughs and the flu and other things. And some doctors' offices were non-existent back then. When he opened after he was converted, he opened his headquarters, the Foundry, in an old cannon factory, and he opened a medical clinic in that, which was just unheard of back then. But it was very Methodist to meet needs, to look around and see whose needs are not being met, and to meet those needs. he also started a journal at Charterhouse, like his mother had before. And he said he's very hard on himself. He says, I was almost continually guilty of outward sins, though they were not as scandalous in the eyes of the world. However, I still read the scriptures, said my morning and evening prayers, but I hoped that I would be saved because I was not as bad as other people, and I had a fondness for religion. He strives to get to know God through the orders of the church and through religious activity and things like this. He will continue striving to do this for about another 25 years. Let's see. Meanwhile, back at the parsonage, the new parsonage that was built, Samuel was still there, and there was reports. Susanna wrote of a ghost in the parsonage, old Jeffrey. And at first, Samuel went, women, and then Samuel experienced old Jeffrey, and both of them wrote John, and John said, parents, But finally he went home, and he conducted some tests, and he concluded, yes, there is a ghost in the rectory. They never met old Jeffrey, but John did give him a name at least. He was not one to take no pig in a poke. He had to have a evidence before he believed. In 1720, he enrolled at Oxford University on a scholarship. He was very disappointed, and here was a church school. He expected it to be this little haven of Christianity, but he said he was disappointed at the low level of morality among the teachers and the students. And it wasn't very much better than it was at Charterhouse. He wrote in his journal, I still said my prayers, public and private, read the scriptures, several other books of religion, yet I had no much as a notion of inward holiness. Now see, he's struggling and struggling. You ever been that point in your life where you're just trying to find the Lord, trying to do what's right, but still there's some great hole in your heart, and you don't know what's missing? He would continue that until he's about 35 years old. When he was 22 years old, he sensed a call into ministry. Late one chilly evening, he was walking home from somewhere to his dorm room, and he met a very poor man who was poorly clothed in rags, and it was a very cold night. He encouraged him to put on a heavier coat, and he said, I have no other clothes besides what I have on right here. However, he was joyful and thankful. He said he thanked God for the clothes that he had. He thanked him for the water which he had to drink, and he had only water to drink. John asked, he was curious. John was frustrated. Here was a poor man who was joyful. And he said, what else are you thankful for? He said, I'm thankful for the dry stones that I have to lie upon at home. I'm thankful that he's given me my life, my being, my heart, and my desire to serve him. John was very impressed by this poor man. He never forgot him. His gratitude in spite of his circumstances. Never met anybody quite like him. Two books that strongly influenced John Wesley more than any other. They're still available today. They're wonderful books. One is Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ, which just describes what a true Christian who is one who seeks to live a life of Christ-like life, what exactly that means in your life. It is a wonderful book. And Jeremy Taylor, Holy Living and Holy Dying. These were monumental books in John's life. And he said the point was not only are we supposed to live holy lives, but when we die, it's supposed to be a revival. And John's death, which hopefully I have time to tell you about, was an amazing thing, a marvel for all who witnessed it, how joyful he was. He said about Thomas à Kempis, I began to see that true religion was centered in the heart, and that God's laws extended to all our thoughts as well as words and actions. Why is it that we church people continually miss Jesus' point, where Jesus is to come and in our hearts and dwell with us every day, every hour, to determine how we live, how we think, how we focus, what we focus our eyes on. Christianity is a way of believing and thinking and acting and influencing others. We endlessly make it something else. We make it a matter of church rituals, or going down to the Salvation Army or something, which are all okay, but they're not the core of Christianity, which is the personal relationship with Jesus, which results in personal holiness. Holiness is defined by Scripture. Okay, and why won't we get that? It's because I think we don't want to be personally holy. We have things we'd rather do. But anyway, John he can't get this quite yet, and he's struggling and striving, wondering why he's a Christian, a priest nonetheless, and he's so miserable. He's ordained deacon in 1725, elder in 1728. Susanna was thrilled, but Samuel said, now, don't become a priest just because of the money. John said, yeah, you're one to talk about that. He thought that was rather ironic because they were always poor. Following his ordination, he was elected a fellow at Oxford, his alma mater now. A fellow was a teaching assistant. He was paid £30 a year for this. From this point on, he will live on £30 a year. No, I'm sorry. His salary was £30. He learned. He was learning about stewardship. He wanted to see just how little money he had to have to live on, and he narrowed that down to £28. Okay, and so that first year he lived on £28 and gave £2 away. He would later make as much as £150 a year, but he always, the rest of his life, lived on £28 a year and whatever else he would give away. He wrote books later in life. He wrote in his journal, I accidentally got rich several times. I've said that. One more, do it once more, Lord, for your servant. He said, but I gave it away as soon as I could, lest it find a home in my pocket. And that's how he was with money. He, toward the end of his life, he said, if I have in my pocket upon my death more than it takes to pay the undertaker to bury me, my eulogist may call me a thief and a robber. And sure enough, he made thousands upon thousands of pounds, and he gave it all away except what he absolutely had to live on. But anyway, he's a graduate now. He's a teacher. He's very intelligent, and he goes back. Samuel gets sick, and he asks John, will you come back and help me in the parish? So John goes back to Epworth for a while. Samuel has two parishes, Epworth and Root, W-R-O-O-T, and he called those people half beasts and half devils. Objective view from a preacher of his flock, but they were. And John worked at Root. It was his only experience as a parish priest. From that time on, he would be either a teacher or an evangelist. And then finally, Oxford called and wrote and said, look, if you're going to be a paid fellow, you need to get back here and do the things that fellows do. So Samuel got better, and he went back. And by this time, his little brother, Charles, who was 3 years younger, was at Oxford. And he had formed a thing called the Holy Club. And the Holy Club was a group of ministerial students who studied the Bible, and they did devotionals together, and they studied the biblical languages together, and a few other things. However, Charles, now you see, John and Charles are very different, okay? John is very left-brained and organized. Charles has no left brain. He's right-brained. He's a musician. I mean, you know how they are. And so Charles is very passionate and very creative. He writes poems every day, and some of them are amazing. Hymns with 32 verses and other things, and so Charles comes back and he likes the idea of the Holy Club, but Charles has it in disarray, and he just how musicians are, and he just loves the idea. But John takes over as the curate of the Holy Club, and he puts them in order, and he gives them rules to live by. John writes rules for everything. He writes rules for singing. I'm going to tell you some of those on Monday night. Here are some of his rules that he inflicted upon the Holy Club. had to answer these questions every time they met. Have I used every chance to do good and prevent evil? Have I considered anything too precious to part with in order to serve my neighbor? These are really pretty good questions that we Methodists ought to ask. Have I spent at least an hour every day speaking to someone about Christianity? Have you? I'm afraid I haven't. I need to do better. When speaking to strangers, have I made it clear what Christianity is and is not, that they might clearly understand God? Have I persuaded everyone I can to attend worship? And a bunch more questions. Later, he would also form, in the Methodist Society, he would form societies, classes, and bands, and he would ask even more strict questions. I'll tell you more about those tomorrow. You think it's tough being a Methodist today. Once this moved him. He was going home on a cold night, and he met a poor girl with only a thin linen dress on. And he said, "You seem half starved and frozen. Go home and put a coat on," kind of like he had earlier. She said, "I have no coat, sir. This is all I have." He reached into his pocket to give her some money, and he remembered he had spent them all a day or two before on paintings. And when he went back to his room, those paintings seemed to scowl at him because saying, "Shame on you for buying us," instead of helping that girl. He always remembered those scowls, and maybe they were. Samuel died in 1735. His last words were, "The inward witness, son, the inward witness." That is the strongest proof of Christianity. At the time, John had no idea what he was talking about, but he would a few years later. The same day as his funeral, his debtors zoomed in and started taking furniture out of the parsonage. John was very worried over his mother, now a widow, afraid she was going to be a beggar. There was no welfare. There was no Social Security, anything like that. Samuel had written a commentary on Job, had recently finished it, completed it, and so he self-printed it, and so he made an appointment with the queen and got an audience with her. He showed it to her, hoping that she would publish it, and he said she was frolicking in a silly way with her handmaidens, and so she looked at it, commented on how pretty it was, and dismissed him. So he thought, well, that didn't work. But while he was in London, he met General James Oglethorpe. And James Oglethorpe had founded a colony in Georgia in the New World called Savannah, and it's still there today. Believe me, if you've ever been to Savannah, anybody been to Savannah? I've been there. There's statues of John Wesley, Casey, and believe me, John Wesley would be shocked if he knew there were statues of him in Savannah because of what a disaster his experience was there, which I'll tell you about here in wrapping this up. So he was on a ship in the Atlantic. It took 2 to 2.5 months to cross from England to the New World. And in the middle of the ocean, a great storm struck. And John and Charles were there, and 2 other members from the Holy Club, 4 of them. And as the ship rocked and pitched and creaked and groaned, they all thought they were going to die. They were terrified. But on this ship was a group of Christians called Moravians. They were this group was from Germany. The Moravians were followers of Jan Hus, who was a reformer 100 years before Martin Luther. But for a lot of the main reasons, they persecuted him. They killed Jan Hus because he was a Catholic priest who protested some of the corruption in the Roman Catholic Church at the time, as Martin Luther did. But Martin Luther's life was spared. Jan Hus was not so lucky. They burned him at the stake, and it was a terrible thing. I think the Pope, about 20 years ago, offered an apology for Jan Hus's martyrdom. Anyway, they were on the ship, and these Moravians, while the Holy Clubbers were scared to death, the Moravians were singing a hymn. And he marveled at this. They didn't seem afraid at all. And he said, even the Moravian children were but playing on the deck of the ship, as if on a calm summer day. And John had never seen anything like this. And when the storm subsided, John sought out the leader of the Moravians and asked him, "Weren't you afraid to die?" And the Moravian looked back at him and said, well, no. Why do you ask? He said, "We were horrified." John wrote in his journal, I'm a priest. How can I call myself even a Christian if I'm afraid to die?" Very good question. And he asked the Moravian. And the Moravian said, "We're not afraid because we have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ." And he said, "Mr. Wesley, do you have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ?" And he kind of played 20 questions with him at that point. Finally, John said, I had no idea what he was talking about. But finally he said, "I do." He said, "But I lied." Just to get rid of the Moravian. But he never forgot this little conversation. And he would ponder this another 2.5 years before his own conversion. Now, when they got out on on the ship, he met a young girl, 15 years old, Sophia Hopke. He tutored her. She and her family were coming to America to begin a new life. And he fell in love with her. John was 32, I think, and she was 15 or 16. And fell in love with her, which was not uncommon back then. And so he, in his journal, all of a sudden he becomes very happy and contented. And he says, "Miss Sophie came for catechism. Miss Sophie came for prayers, morning and evening. Miss Sophie came." She is John has several women in his life, none successfully, but he always describes them in these effusive, wonderful terms. She's angelic, she's beautiful, she's spiritual, she's wonderful, and so was Miss Sophie. And he and she became a thing, and also became an object of gossip, because who wants the preacher running around with one of the youth? He hadn't read the youth director handbook. Don't date your own youth. But he hadn't written it yet. And so he and Sophie, he would take her on these mission trips around. Now, don't get him wrong. He didn't do anything naughty. He writes that he didn't do anything naughty. He said, "However, I'm tempted. I don't know if she is, but I don't know how long I can take this." And John causes a stir. They don't like him anyway because he's very academic. And most of the folks in Savannah had come across when you're running from something, you tend to run west, and for some reason. And when you really have a reason to run from something, you jump the ocean and you go to another continent. And so that's basically what his parishioners were. They were people who came from Europe to get away from people like John Wesley. But John was horrified because he first got out on board. General Oglethorpe said, "You're going to be a missionary to the Indians." And John thought, "Yes, this is my calling. This is the answer to my longings." When he got out, he realized that no, he was to the parishioner, to the immigrants from England and Germany and other places. And then if he had any extra time on his day off, he could go find the Indians out in the trees, in the woods. And he did at times, but he didn't like them and they didn't like him. Charles was sent down 40 or so miles down south to Fort Frederica, which is still there today. Those people were also half beasts and half devils. Charles was also disappointed, and he would stand and he would say, I would stand in the pulpit. I felt compelled to address their transgressions. After every offending sermon, someone would go over to my house and steal a piece of my furniture. he said, in just a few weeks, I had no furniture in my house. He asked if whoever stole his bed, please return it, but he didn't. John and Sophie are talking about getting married, but John has this notion that if he gets married, he'll lose his salvation. He opens the Bible and to ask God. He does this all his life. Opens his Bible, puts his finger down to get a word from God, and they're all negative references. And if you do, you'll regret it. So he tells Sophie, "We're not going to get married, but I've got good news. Let's serve the Lord all of our lives side by side, eunuchs for the Lord." What girl could resist that language? What a hopeless romantic. And Sophie goes, "Okay, like you would." and John gets the first good night's sleep he has in Savannah. It's also the last good night's sleep he'll have, because the very next day Sophie gets engaged to a man named Mr. Williamson. The very next day. Her end of the bargain expired rather soon. And John wrote in his journal, Mr. Williamson, he wrote terrible things about him. He wrote, he is a man not known for his character, his appearance, his spirituality, and least of all his, I don't know, something, his intelligence. Anyway, it's not very much objective. So John, let's see, no, not ready. John makes a fatal mistake. The next Sunday after they're married, they come up for communion, and Mr. and Mrs. Williamson come up, and John refuses to serve her. And she says, why? And he says, because of your unconfessed sins. But if you confess them here before this company, I'll serve you. Well, that didn't happen. And she and Mr. Williamson went out the back door, and she went to her uncle, Mr. Costin, who was a judge, and had him arrested, had John Wesley arrested on 13 trumped-up charges. And had him hauled before the judge several times. His pastorate was eliminated as a preacher, or at least put suspended until this was solved. And several times they would haul him before the judge. They would read the charges, but then he was not allowed to defend himself. There was some kind of a continuance. And John realized this was a setup. And so in the middle of the night, he crossed the river north into South Carolina, got on a boat, went back to England. And as far as we know, he's still a fugitive of Georgia justice, although the statute of limitations may have run out by now. But anyway, for a man who came over to America because he was seeking religion, he didn't have much success. And he was on the way back, the 2.5 months, he is just in the depths of depression. And this kind of encouraged me too, because have you ever been in the depths of depression? Or are you? Have you ever been to a point where you feel like there's no way out of this? And you literally cannot see any way out. John Wesley learned sometime when you're on the bottom of the well, face down, that's the first time that you're inspired to look up. And that's what he did. And so he writes about how depressed he is, and he's as hard on himself as he ever is. I have a fair weather religion, And when things are fine, I believe in God, but when things go south, I don't. And he has all this time going across. But sometimes God uses those dark nights of our souls for great spiritual purposes. Remember that. Sometimes some of us, we won't listen to God until we've lost everything. And God can use that. Out of the worst stuff grows brand new life. And that God thought up recycling before the environmentalists did. So John gets back to England, and he realizes that when he's been failing in England as a missionary, one of his Holy Club friends, George Whitefield, has been succeeding as an evangelist. And George Whitefield has this deep voice like this moving voice and this dramatic countenance in his preaching. And he stands and preaches, and when he does, his voice fills the room. And, if you and I had a voice like this, brother, we could be rich and famous, couldn't we? But we don't, so we just use what we got. And Whitefield is amassing these crowds outside of churches. Now, this was a breach of the law, because the Anglican Church, the law said it wasn't really a sermon unless it was inside an Anglican church that had been blessed by a bishop. You know where that is in the scripture, somewhere. But Whitefield was a pragmatist, and he was so dramatic and such a showman that, and he had results, because he gave invitations, which was never done, and people were coming forward and weeping. It was said that when Whitefield could make men weep by saying a single word, Mesopotamia. See, you laughed. I don't have it. Whatever it is. And once he's preaching, and the windows are open, and people are straining outside to hear him. So in the moment, he just goes out and he stands on a tree stump where everybody can hear him, and he preaches to several thousand. And this is so John. This doubles John's depression, because here he'd gone all this trouble to fail. Whitefield just stayed home and has succeeded. And So this depresses him. And Whitfield says, I want to go to America. And John says, no, trust me, you don't want to do that. I remember saying that. Save your efforts. But Whitfield does. You can't tell the preachers anything, and so he goes several times. Excuse me. I'm sorry. That's what mute buttons are for. But anyway, John Wesley, one evening, one morning, he wakes up, and he feels like God is about to do something on May 24, 1738. And this is the last point I'm going to make. He said, all this day it seemed that God was about to move. He opened the scriptures to many scriptures. Mark 12:34 was one, thou art not far from the kingdom of God. He visited St. Paul Cathedral, and the anthem a choir was singing was from Psalm 130, out of the depths I cry unto thee, O Lord. And he confessed that was all meant for him. And that evening he reluctantly went to a little Moravian society meeting. Now, he had gone back to Germany, and visited with the Moravians, okay? And he wrote to Charles and to his older brother, Samuel Jr., I am as in heaven among the citizens of heaven. However, he didn't really like the Moravians completely because they would just sit around and wait for the Lord to move. And John Wesley was type A and kind of OC, and he wanted to accomplish something, feed somebody or something, and so he kind of got burned out on the Moravians. But anyway, he went to a little Moravian society on Aldersgate Street in London, and he said that there's Peter Burler, the Moravian friend whom he got to know, and he said while a man was reading from Martin Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans, which is incredibly boring, okay, to a guy like me, but to a scholar like Wesley, it's different. He said, he was reading from that, and he said this famous passage, about 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. I began to pray with all my might for those who had in a more especial manner despitefully used me and persecuted me. I then testified openly to all there what I now first felt in my heart. That was John Wesley's conversion. From that point on, he was okay with the Lord, although he still suffered seasons of doubt, he said, and that worried him a little bit. Peter Burler said, the Moravian said, he asked Peter Burler, he said, since I am doubtful, shouldn't I refrain from preaching? And Peter said, no, keep preaching faith. And because you preach it, you'll have it. And then because you have it, you'll preach it. And Wesley thought that a little odd, but he said, you know what? It works. So fake it till you make it is the way that we say it today. The first thing John wanted to do was find Charles, and he did. They met a few days later. Charles, by holy coincidence, just 4 days earlier, had been lying on a bed in the home of Mr. Bray. They didn't have hospitals back then, so when he got sick, you had to get put up in someone's home who would care for you. And he was lying on a bed suffering from pleurisy, and he was drifting off to sleep when he heard a young woman say, in the servant of God, in the name of Jesus of Nazareth, rise and be healed. Thy faith has made thee well. And he opened his eyes. He didn't know who said that. And he said he did feel better. And he looked around, called out, whose voice was that? And a maid presented herself timidly, a serving girl, and she apologized because he was a clergy. She was a mere servant. But she said, I can't help it. The Lord compelled me to say that. And he said, no, honey. He said, those were God's words. And he said, he was healed, or at least he was better. And so Charles was trying to find John, and then John got converted. He was trying to find Charles, and they met each other, and they said, I believe, at the same time. And it was too much to believe that this was merely a coincidence. All their lives, they looked back and knew that God was about to do something great with them. From this point, they will suffer. Now their problems really begin. Okay, now most of them up till now are self-inflicted, but now when they will go into the Anglican churches and convince them they need a Savior, well, they will find they don't want to be convinced, and they'll get kicked out of churches left and right and persecuted, which they were all of the 50 some odd years of their ministry after this. But you never see them discouraged in the old way or doubtful about God. In fact, the more persecution that the Wesleys suffer, the more success they experience, because they come to the point where they are railed against and persecuted in the newspapers and in pulpits everywhere. They're called servants of Satan, and yet all this does is make people say, "Huh, it can't be that bad. I think I'll go hear him when he's coming through town." And so John and Charles preached to upwards of, I think the largest crowd he said was 32,000. Don't ever let the preacher count attendance on Sunday, okay? 32, it looks like 32,000 to me. But now is when the excitement really takes off. And I'll tell you more about that Sunday afternoon, okay? All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Do you have any comments or questions you'd like to ask real quick? Well, good. That was easy. I probably would say, I don't know. I already told you all I know. Anyway, I hope you'll come back, because there is a purpose. This is not more than just a story or a history lesson, and really heading toward a point of wanting to launch you out into a brand new kind of ministry, a way of thinking, and because you have this wonderful building in this excellent location, surrounded by people with needs. And it's just something we need to do to change, and I want to be the initiator of that, the catalyst of that, and I hope you come to all these sessions, because I'll try not to repeat myself, and I'll try to say stuff that really matters. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
I just want to thank Tom for just a wonderful learning and teaching session here. I knew some of that, but certainly not all of it by any means. And it was great. And so tomorrow you'll be preaching at our 9 o'clock service. And then at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, he'll be preaching again right in here. Then Monday at 1 o'clock, he'll be in the sanctuary. And Monday evening at 5:30, we'll be in the fellowship building, which is right behind the church, directly west of the church, and we have a stage in there, and that's when he will be putting on the musical drama by Charles Wesley. When do you want to unload that? Monday afternoon, sir? Okay. Okay. Perhaps after the 3 o'clock one tomorrow? Okay. That would be good. And thank y'all. Thank everyone here. Spread the word. It's only going to get better and better and better. And we will realize what strong roots we have. I mean, we just forget, to learn about all of the persecution and the turmoil that was going on in England prior to John being born, and the destitute, and we think how bad it is today. I don't think it was that bad. And so the thing is, God is good. God revives us. He regenerates us. And we have a wonderful worship place here to spread the good news. Thank y'all for coming. We hope you'll come back.